Kia ora, I'm David Whittet, and I'm delighted to read to you from my new novel, The Road to Madhapur. This heart-wrenching story follows the lives of an idealistic Kiwi doctor and an Australian missionary's daughter, whose lives collide in a remote Indian village. While the book is a work of fiction, the story draws on my experience as a family doctor and includes many real-life events, including some defining moments from my time on a family medicine project in rural India. So before we dive into the book, let's take a moment to set the scene. Picture this: doctors hold their consultations outside on the street. Medicines are in short supply. Equipment is scarce. And when the monsoon strikes, reaching those displaced by the floods brings almost insurmountable obstacles. These are the challenges that our protagonists face on the road to Madhapur. We first meet Theo as a medical student who dreams of making the world a better place. He's not thrilled to be stuck in another dull lecture on tuberculosis, a disease he believes no longer exists due to modern medicine. Chapter 1. University of Otago Medical School, Dunedin, New Zealand, July 1986. Professor Goulding rapped his cane on my desk. "Wake up, Mr. Malone." I sat up with a jolt. The professor leant over me. "What are the pathological changes in pulmonary tuberculosis?" Why did he always pick on me? Hands shot up all around me. Was I the only one who didn't know the answer? "This isn't the first time I've caught you drifting." Professor Goulding pointed to the screen with his cane. "Look at this slide and tell me what you see." "It's a section of a lung," I mumbled, "with tuberculosis." Professor Goulding snorted. I should have thought that was obvious. Everyone laughed, especially those show-offs in the front row. Professor Goulding's eyes drilled into mine. "It's called a granuloma." He put another slide up on the screen. "Name this structure." I hadn't a clue what it was called, and I didn't care either. Modern antibiotics had eliminated tuberculosis, and learning about it in such minute detail wouldn't prepare us for the challenges of medicine in the outside world. It's I dribbled to a standstill. "I'm not sure, sir." More hands went up. "It's the interlobular vein," one student said. "Subsegmental branch," another added. Professor Goulding glared at me through tortoiseshell-rimmed glasses that must have been at least as old as he was. "You just don't know your anatomy, Mr. Malone. You need to buck up your ideas if you're going to get through your fourth-year exams." It was all I could do to stop myself from bolting out of the lecture theatre. Hadn't Professor Goulding heard about AIDS and the new viruses that threatened the future of humanity? What was I doing here? Why had I chosen to study medicine? It seemed a distant memory now, that day during my last year at school, when a Ugandan refugee visited our class. It hadn't meant much when our teacher explained Akiki was the sole survivor of an entire community wiped out by AIDS. Everything changed when his foster mother led him into the classroom, and I caught sight of the 14-year-old's fractured eyes. Miss Kershaw, our teacher, sat Akiki on a stool in front of the class. His foster mother stood beside him, with her hand on his back. "Welcome to Ramataka College," Miss Kershaw said. "We've been learning about your country, Akiki. Some of our students have got together to sponsor children in Uganda. She pointed to a giant map of Africa on the wall. "You came from Kaluba, didn't you?" Akiki shuffled in his seat and half nodded. "We'd like to hear about your life in Uganda," Miss Kershaw said. "I understand you used to help your mum take care of your little sisters." Akiki glanced up at the class, then hid his face. Perhaps he couldn't speak English. Trust Miss Kershaw to embarrass him. Akiki's foster mother stroked his shoulder. "Remember what I said. Deep breaths." Akiki raised his head, his lip twitching. "You want to know about Abo and the fire?" "They were your sisters?" Miss Kershaw asked. Akiki nodded. I spotted a tear in the corner of his eye. It was all too much for the poor kid. I just wanted Miss Kershaw to stop interrogating him. "Our village didn't have a well," Akiki said. "Every morning I took Abo and the fire to get water from a pipe in the wall of the council building." "Extraordinary," Miss Kershaw said. "We're all so used to just turning on the tap to get water. So tell us, how did you get the water from the pipe?" Akiki gestured with his hands. The pipe jutted out of the concrete wall and had a tap on the end. We filled our buckets and then carried them home on our heads. My jaw dropped. Akiki spoke so fluently, not the broken English I was expecting. "It wasn't all work, was it?" Akiki's foster mother said. "Tell the class what you did after you'd finished your chores." Akiki grinned. "We played football with some other kids, kicking a ball made from rags and old bits of tyres." "What?" Miss Kershaw said. "Didn't the scraps go all over the place?" "We tied them together with string," Akiki replied. "Our feet got cut and bruised from all the garbage on the ground." Miss Kershaw raised an eyebrow. "You played barefooted?" "We didn't care," Akiki said. "Sometimes we'd help Uncle Ichao chase his pigs back into their pen. Then we'd take turns to ride on his bike as a reward." Akiki's foster mother held up a picture of the village. I pictured Akiki and his mates kicking the homemade football around and imagined the cheers when they scored a goal. Miss Kershaw put more photos of the village on the blackboard. Riding a bike along those blood-red dirt roads through the crowded street markets must have been thrilling. Akiki dabbed his eyes. "We were happy until your mum and dad got sick," Miss Kershaw said. "Yes." Akiki's voice broke, and he covered his head with his arms. Akiki's foster mother put her arms around him. "You were so brave. Tell everyone how you looked after the family." Akiki took his hands away from his face and steadied himself on the stool. "My Aunt Mugisa taught me how to cook." I could almost smell the spices as Akiki described his aunt's roadside stall. Abo and the fire were always hungry, he said. Curried cabbage was their favourite. Nick, the class smart-ass, sniggered. "Curried cabbage? Yuck! No wonder they died." I glared at Nick. What a bastard! I'd gladly have wrung his neck. "Any more from you, Nick, and you can stand outside," Miss Kershaw said, then turned back to Akiki. "I bet it was delicious." Akiki eyed Nick. "Curried cabbage is much tastier than the burgers you eat out here." "Brilliant! I had to stop myself jumping up to give a Kiki a round of applause. And doubtless more nutritious. Miss Kershaw paused and took a deep breath. I can't imagine how you coped after your parents died. I cursed Miss Kershaw under my breath. Why did she have to say that? Akiki wiped his face on his sleeve. Aunt Mugissa helped me look after Arbo and the fire, until they got sick as well and had to go to the sanatorium. I had tears in my eyes too when Akiki described the sanatorium and how he defied the village elders by staying to comfort his sisters in their final hours. After your sisters died, Miss Kershaw said, the elders sent you to a refugee camp, didn't they? Akiki nodded. There were hundreds of us in that camp, all crammed into shacks with plastic roofs. How long were you in the camp? Miss Kershaw asked. Tell us how you came to New Zealand. No more. Can't you see he's had enough? It's all a blur, Akiki replied. I got a fever too. They thought I'd caught what my sisters had and moved me into a shack on my own. Next thing I knew, I was in the back of a jeep with this Kiwi bloke. That was Pastor Campbell, Akiki's foster mother said, from the Ugandan mission. Akiki hugged his foster mother. Whoever he was, he found me a new mum. That's wonderful, Miss Kershaw said. Now, who's got a question for Akiki? Silence. Then Nick yawned noisily. I hesitated. There was so much I wanted to ask, but that would stir up more painful memories for Akiki. Miss Kershaw eyed the class. No takers? She clasped her hands together. Well, Akiki is joining us for lunch, so that will give you all a chance to get to know him. Now, can I have a volunteer to look after Akiki? I have matters to discuss with his foster mother. I was first with my hand up. Thank you, Theo, Miss Kershaw said. Make Akiki feel at home. Now, if you'll excuse us. Miss Kershaw and Akiki's foster mother left for the staff room. Typical. No overcooked beef goulash for them. Theo and Akiki forge a deep bond over lunch and become lifelong friends. Akiki's story inspires Theo to train as a doctor and make a difference in the developing world. But back in the lecture theatre, Theo remains frustrated and no nearer to achieving his goal. 4 years later, and here I was at uni, with my head slumped over a desk, struggling to keep my eyes open during another endless lecture on tuberculosis, from a professor whose hair was as white as his lab coat. I came to medical school to change the world, not to listen to some old fart describing the microscopic changes in a disease that no longer existed. I really enjoyed writing Akiki's story. I found myself transported to that vibrant Ugandan village as I worked on the scene. The rich colours and enticing aromas of Akiki's world came alive in my mind while I wrote, visualising the scene through the eyes of this remarkable boy. In the second chapter, Theo finally escapes medical school for a general practice attachment in South Dunedin. His GP tutor, Dr. Ralph Greenslade, sends him on an assignment to assess an elderly farmer who's been coughing up blood. The farm loomed on the horizon, dark and foreboding, like something out of a horror movie. I half expected Norman Bates' mother to appear in the large upstairs window. The dirt track to the yard challenged the rugged four-wheel drive vehicle, the engine choking, spluttering and smoking as if it didn't want to get there. With a crash of the gearbox, I eventually pulled up outside the entrance. Ugh! The farmyard stank. I held my breath and waded through the mud to the battered front door. I could hear coughing coming from inside as I stood on the doorstep. Clutching my Gladstone bag, I grasped the Gothic-style door knocker and gave it a hearty thump. An Asian girl, who can't have been much over 20, opened the door and announced herself as Lilybeth. As she led me down a cold, damp passageway, the sound of coughing grew louder. An old grandfather clock ticked in the hall, punctuating the wheeze emanating from the corridor. Lilybeth marched swiftly towards Mr. Evans' room, looking over her shoulder with a frown, as if to chide me for dawdling. The musty atmosphere in the bedroom almost made me gag. As I approached the broken-down four-poster bed, the stench of urine from the mattress was unbearable. I reached for a handkerchief from my pocket and covered my mouth. Lilybeth clearly noticed my repulsion and scowled at me sourly. Accompanying Dr. Greenslade on his rounds had opened my eyes to squalor, but not this wide. I bit my lip, inwardly ashamed that my emotions had overridden my professionalism. But before I could stop myself, I staggered back and confronted Lilybeth. "How could you let Mr. Evans languish like this? It's a disgrace." Lilybeth jumped up and slapped me hard on the face. Bloody hell, what had I walked into? "You rude man," she said. "You very rude man. Are you a real doctor?" She turned to Mr. Evans. "I'm going to call Dr. Greenslade and ask him to come." "No, Lily." The old man shuffled up on his threadbare pillow. "Wait. This boy is just a student. You need a proper doctor. And he needs to learn. We're going to give him a chance." Mr. Evans beckoned me over. "Go on, young man. Do your damnedest." Lilybeth gave me the evil eye while I questioned Mr. Evans about his symptoms. She watched in silence when I conducted my examination. "So, what have I got, Doc?" Evans asked, his voice quaking when I finished the physical. "We must do some investigations," I replied, the history still filtering through my brain, starting with some blood tests. "Bad, isn't it?" he spluttered, grabbing Lilybeth's arm and pulling her towards him. "She's got a sharp tongue, this one, and a temper. But I don't know what I'd have done without my Lil these past few months." I glanced down at the notes I'd scribbled while taking the history and rubbed my forehead. Suddenly, all the pieces of the jigsaw came together. Mr. Evans was losing weight, cachectic. His skin was erupting and riddled with staphylococcal infection. They were all cardinal signs of a compromised immune system. I watched Lilybeth climb onto the bed and perch herself on his lap. Cogs ticked in my brain. I'd read about the spread of HIV in the Philippines in the medical journals. I took a deep breath and addressed Lilybeth with a stammer in my voice. I'll have to check you over too. You'll need a blood test as well. I think you both have AIDS." Lilybeth jumped off the bed and smacked me viciously on the other cheek. "You bad man! Very bad man!" The moment I parked the practice vehicle in the doctor's bay back at the medical centre, I knew there was trouble. A middle-aged woman stormed out of the surgery, glared at me and waved her fist. My mouth went dry. She got into her car and slammed the door shut. Dr. Greenslade came out into the car park. "That was Mr. Evans' daughter. She's not happy." "I can see that." I watched her rev her car engine and drive away at speed. "She's going to find it difficult to cope when she has to confront her father's diagnosis." "I think you'd better come inside," Dr. Greenslade said. "What's happened to your face? You look like the walking wounded, not the doctor." "The housemaid sure knows how to land a punch." I rubbed my cheeks, which had swollen and stung like hell. "Sometimes the truth hurts." Dr. Greenslade wasn't his usual affable self as he steered me into his consulting room. Perhaps he was just testing me. Regardless, I was supremely confident of my assessment. Bracing myself, I took a seat and launched into my case presentation. While I spoke, Dr. Greenslade unwound a paperclip until it was straight, but he didn't put it back together. So that's the only diagnosis you've considered, is it? AIDS. Can you think of another reason why a man living in poverty might start coughing up blood? I stared back blankly, still entirely sure of my diagnosis. Dr. Greenslade cleared his throat. His eyes locked onto mine. A nasty disease is rearing its ugly head again, making a resurgence amongst the malnourished and debilitated. You'll have had lectures about it. A momentary pause that lasted forever. Actually, Mr. Evans has pulmonary tuberculosis. 3 days later, Professor Rutherford, the Professor of General Practice, summoned me to his office. "What were you thinking?" He stood behind his desk, towering over me, his voluminous moustache twitching. "Telling a pillar of the farming community he's got AIDS? Insinuating he's been sleeping with the maid and accusing the poor girl of being a prostitute? Are you asking to get thrown out of medical school?" "It wasn't like that, sir. Honestly, I was only trying to help. Dr. Greenslade told me the man's daughter was worried he'd caught something from the girl." "Dr. Greenslade expected you to act professionally. And what did you do? Make absurd assumptions and scare them to death about AIDS?" Professor Rutherford shook his head and sat down at his desk. "Were you asleep during my lecture on communication and confidentiality?" "No, sir." It was true. That was one of the few lectures where I'd taken notes. No use trying to explain. Professor Rutherford wasn't listening and continued to lay into me. "You can thank your lucky stars that I've saved your place at the university. Believe me, it wasn't easy." He looked me straight in the eye. "You'll never make a GP. A pathologist, perhaps, but not a general practitioner. If you're that obsessed with AIDS, perhaps you should consider a career as a virologist. Work on a cure. But you can't work with people, that's definite." He hammered the desk with his hand. "As for missing tuberculosis in a debilitated patient coughing up blood, well, Professor Goulding tells me you seldom paid attention in his lectures." Could I possibly have felt any worse? When I got up to leave the room, Professor Rutherford called after me. "Dr. Greenslade is so upset by the whole affair that he won't take any more students. You've deprived future medical students of one of our best GP teachers." I had let down my guru. How could I live with myself? "You will never make a GP. A pathologist, perhaps, but not a general practitioner." If that was the case, I might as well give up now. Continuing my medical studies was a waste of time and money, mine and everyone else's. I hope you enjoyed my reading. If this excerpt has inspired you to read the whole book, The Road to Madhapur is available in print and ebook from bookshops and major ebook sellers worldwide. For a personally signed copy, visit my website at davidwhittet.com. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch and listen to my book reading.